Evening or good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're doing okay. Welcome to the Assyrianism class. We're just going to give it a couple of minutes as people come in. And I just want to welcome you and thank you for participating in this class, which I hope you will find interesting, enlightening, and perhaps even inspiring. We'll see. I really also look forward to your comments, questions, queries at the end of this class. Um, the way I do these classes, just so you know, is that I will begin to give the lecture. I will then stop at the end as I present screens because the way that I make points is with a PowerPoint. And I will stop and then take your questions. So if you don't mind just holding on to the questions if you have them, or you can, of course, always send questions in the chat. But I'm sorry, I won't be able to look at them as I'm giving the lecture. So please bear with me. All right. With that, let us proceed. Assyrianism. What is it? What was it before? In other words, how did this idea, this movement, this struggle in the abstract and in reality take place or take shape? Does it have any effect on us today? If so, what? What type of effect does it have? How does it operate? Through what structures? What are the attributes of Assyrianism? And finally, what does its future look like? This is basically the abstract of the class, if you will, of this class, of these various lectures that we're going to have. Now, I want to talk about, before we begin with today's class, what the classes are going to look like in terms of the dates and so on. So we will today proceed on what is a nation and what is nationalism, just so we understand how various scholars define it, because Assyrianism is not something we can really understand only in the abstract. In other words, isolated from itself and from the phenomenon around the world. So we will look at what various scholars say. We will look at various nations. We will probe the study of nationalism to understand the underpinnings of what we call Assyrianism or Assyrian nationalism. We will look at other nations and the way they viewed their history. We will have a survey, a quick survey of Germans, the French, Arabs, Jews, Turks, Iraqis, and so on, and some other nations. We will then have a quick tour through Assyrian history. That's on May 22nd. And we will split that into three parts: understanding ancient Assyrian history and nationhood, understanding Assyrian history and nationhood during Christian times. We will then probe modern Assyrian history, what that looks like. We will then discuss the rise of what we call Assyrianism, the early pillars of the Assyrian movement, Benjamin Arsanis, Freydona Turaya. We will discuss the literature of Assyrianism, something that Dr. David Wilmhurst calls shrill and bombastic. That's a critic of Assyrianism. We will look at writers such as William Daniel, Naum Faiq, Ad-Day Al-Khas, and the revival of the ancient traditions, if you will, of the Assyrians. We will look at John Al-Khas and modernism, the modernist movement. By no means is it exclusively John Al-Khas. We will look at what phenomena like the Assyrian Martyrs' Day is about. we will study the writings and the art of Hannibal Alchas in a couple of lectures. We will look at the writings of Mishael Lazar Isa and Benjamin Gendilu, or Gundlov, as his name is written in English. These are writers of short stories that have much to say about the existence of modern Assyrians. We will look at innovators among Assyrians, Ninos Aho and Yosef Bid Yosef. We will understand their poetry. All of this will be, of course, based on translations from the original Assyrian. And I think you're going to enjoy this because you're going to hear the Assyrian words in a lot of this. So I will be quoting from Assyrian, but translating at the same time. So you'll get the English and the Assyrian. We will also discuss Assyrianism and the churches and how there are differing views as to the relationship of ethnicity or nationalism or Assyrianism and Christianity, how some reject it, how some support it. We will look at contemporary Assyrian poets. We will look at folk songs. We will actually listen to folk songs and try to understand how this phenomenon is being upheld by these traditions, folk songs. And then finally, in October, we will study Assyrianism and the diaspora. So what is a nation and what is nationalism? That's today's lecture. Let's try to understand how this is understood before we get to Assyrian nationalism or Assyrianism. When we think of a nation, do we think of any of these attributes? Language, of course, we've always heard it said, without our language, we cannot maintain our existence as Assyrians. Land, we often hear this critique, of course, that land is the most critical or geography is the most critical. What about customs and traditions or culture? What about history or understanding of history? Race or genetics or DNA? Religion, identity, or all of these put together? What exactly is it? How do we define a nation? Now, oftentimes we think, okay, a nation is a group of people with a shared sense of identity, a culture, a history. Of course, this is sometimes or oftentimes, but it is not always the case. Language, territory, and often a common government or political structure, but again, not always. The people often see themselves or view themselves or perceive themselves as part of a cohesive entity with a distinct identity. I affiliate as X, and often aspire to self-governance or statehood, according to many of the writers on nationalism. Now, is this the case always? Let's think of it in terms of how the Assyrians perceive themselves or how the Assyrians perceive their own desire for self-governance or statehood. Does it exist? And if so, to what extent? Nations can be large or small, encompassing millions of individuals or just a few hundred. Yes, it's possible to have a very small group of people defined as a nation, but oftentimes various factors such as the size of a nation or how little territory it has often precludes it from being classified as a nation, and possibly it is classified as a tribe. Not always. The concept of a nation is not always synonymous with the concept of a state. Now, one of the writers we will look at, scholars of nationalism, is Johann Gerder, a German nationalist who is often labeled as a person who believed in the idea of the nation being requiring a state or having a nation state. The very idea comes from Herder, according to a lot of people, but that is not true, as we will see. He believed in the culture of the German people much more than the requirement of the state, for example. Now, in addition, a state can encompass multiple nations, as, for example, the case of Iraq or Iran or Syria or any of the Middle Eastern states or even Western states. Oftentimes, we view Western nations as being exclusively possessing the domain of the nation state or the attribute of the nation state. But really, when we look very carefully, and we will in this class, that's not always the case. In fact, it's mostly not the case. Now, political scientists like Benedict Anderson, who burst on the scene in the 1980s with his book Imagined Communities, makes this point that a nation really is an imagined political community. Imagined because members of the nation, even the smallest nation, oftentimes don't know each other in terms of the whole. And so it is a construct. It is imagined within the minds of the people within that community. And we will study more what Benedict Anderson says about this phenomenon of nationalism and contextualize Assyrianism within it and see if the Assyrians meet the criteria that is set by Benedict Anderson. Now, I found this comment very interesting in terms of imagination. And I want you to think of it in terms of the Assyrian experience. This was a comment made by Yuval Hariri. I found it on YouTube, out of all places, and I give the link there. And he said something very interesting and said it in a very lively way. He said, you know, humans don't really fight over territory and food. They fight over imaginary stories in their mind. I worked in Jerusalem. It's one of the most fought over places in human history. It's hard to understand why. It's not such a great place. And he goes on, he said, you know, it's got stones, you'll see pigeons, you'll see streets, hear horns. It's not a big deal. A very ordinary place, just like any other place. No oil fields, no gold mines, nothing. But in their imagination, people think, oh, this is not a stone. This is a holy stone. This is not just any place. It is full of angels and gods and saints and prophets. And they fight over this. Now, these are the comments of Yuval Hariri, and I quote him here because I want you to think in terms of how we also, as Assyrians, for example, imagine when we look at the walls of Nineveh or the mountains in Hakkari or the fields in Urmia. And what do we imagine? Do we see them merely as a place, as a very ordinary place, no gold mines and so on? Or do we see as human beings, do we attribute as human beings something more? Now, when we speak of identity, again, the idea of imagining is very important. And according to Rashid Khalidi, when discussing Palestinian identity, he tells us the quintessential Palestinian experience, which illustrates some of the most basic issues raised by Palestinian identity, takes place at the border, an airport, a checkpoint, in short, at any one of those many modern barriers where identities are checked and verified. So according to Professor Khalidi, the Palestinian imagines himself as different than any other person, in part because of this experience, the experience at the airport, at a checkpoint, at particular places where he or she is asked for his passport and cannot escape scrutiny easily wherever he is encountering such an experience. So that identity is being defined really by experiencing others. So the other is very important in terms of defining the self here for the Palestinian, according to Rashid Khalidi. In terms of Zionist history, one of the things, or say Jewish history, one of the things that, and we're going to study this very carefully, one of the things that we need to keep in mind is oftentimes for nationalists, understanding their own or perceiving their own history requires a rejection of certain customs, habits, or perceptions of the past. And so we are told by one leading historian on Zionism, Zerubbabel, Yael, Zionist reading of Jewish history provided ideological framework for understanding and legitimizing its vision for the future. Predominantly secular Zionist movement. We will see, and we will remember this for the future, that keep this in mind, when we encounter the Zionist movement, we often think it is Jewish, it is a Jewish movement, but really it is a secular movement that turned away from traditional Jewish memory in order to construct its own counter memory. Again, we're speaking of construction, we're speaking of imagining, and this is a very important factor. And we will visit other writers who keep telling us again and again in the study of nationalism, and of course, Assyrianism is within this larger picture of understanding all of these nationalistic movements, that what has to happen is that one or many are constructing, are building, are imagining the nation. It is not something inherent. It is not something natural. It is not, some people will disagree, and we will talk about this, primordial. And this is, of course, the view of many, I would say the overwhelming majority of those who study nationalism. And we can see it within Assyrian history. And looking at this quote by Ashur Yusuf, having denominations, having the Church of the East, for example, the Syriac Orthodox Church, the Chaldean Church, is a part of Assyrian history, of course. But according to a nationalist or an Assyrianist, Ashur Yusuf, he sees it as a hindrance, just as the Jewish nationalist or the Zionist viewed the immediate Jewish past as something to be rejected. We are told by Ashur Yusuf that the hindrance before the advancement of the Assyrian people was not so much the attacks from without as it was from within. And he tells us we have these struggles between Monophysites, who are also called Jacobites, Diophysites, or the Church of the East, or Nestorians, is a good example, he tells us. These denominational disputes, and of course, Ashur Yusuf himself became a Protestant, was educated with American missionaries, learned also nationalism from, interacted with Armenians as well. And he tells us that this is the problem that we have to reject. To this very day, Assyrians are still known by their various names, such as Nestorians, Jacobites, and Chaldeans. So what he is doing is, from this perspective that we are studying, according to many of these scholars who study nationalism, is constructing, reimagining, or imagining an entity that rejects its immediate past. And I say this because oftentimes we say, well, we want to, we want to preserve everything. Part of being a nation really is, as many scholars will say, is partly rejecting the past or certain aspects of the past and remembering other aspects. So what is this imagined, again, or constructed means? That the nation is not an inherent or natural entity, as I said, but rather a product of human imagination, social interaction, and historical processes. The nation is created and sustained according to many of these, and we're going to have disputes or disagreements through social interaction, cultural practices, and shared beliefs, rather than being an objective reality. People simply imagine themselves as part of a great number of people, as Benedict Anderson said, and they imagine that they are like them. They are Assyrian, we are Assyrian. Nations emerge and evolve over time in specific historical contexts, according to many of these writers, often in response to political, economic, or social changes. In other words, they're not simply frozen in time and they just proceed throughout history unchanged. You heard Rashid Khalidi talk about how Palestinian identity is shaped at the airport with checkpoints, for example. People come to feel connected to each other through shared symbols, values, and experiences, imagine themselves as a people or community or nation. This imagined community forms the basis of national identity. National identity is then reinforced through cultural practices. As we said before, we're going to study John Olkhas and Edde Olkhas and William Daniel and see what their contributions are to the reinforcement of Assyrianism. Such as language, education, religion, art, and literature. Nations are not static entities, but can change over time in response to internal and external factors. I wanted to make this point here. Of course, if we think of the Assyrian nation proceeding through time, and we will make references to the ancient past and connect with the medieval past, I guess you can call it, or classical past, as well as modern times, and try to understand what really survived and what did not, and how do we see it today. Nationalism is often viewed as a political ideology or a movement that prioritizes the interest, unity, and sovereignty of a particular nation or ethnic group. Now, sovereignty, does it always have to be a state? Does it always have to be a government? I'll leave this to you to think about. It often involves a strong sense of pride, loyalty, and attachment to one's nation, as well as a desire for self-determination or independence. We are told that by Ernest Gellner, one of the leading writers, an anthropologist, and a political scientist and philosopher, I suppose one can call him, that nationalism is not the awakening of nations to self-consciousness. It invents nations where they do not exist. So others, and we will see how this idea began of imagining the nation, constructing the nation, as Ernest Gellner and so many others came to believe is the case. So we understood nationalism as this sentiment, and then let's understand patriotism, because we often have this vision of, well, nationalism is very bad, but patriotism is really good. I would shy away from such simplistic understanding, but for the sake of just knowing how people use this terminology, I want you to really become familiar with this idea that patriotism is often in the United States viewed as something good. They're both expressions of attachment to a country or a nation, one could say, but they differ in their emphasis and implications. Typically, patriotism is viewed as a reference to referring to a state or country. I love my country. whereas nationalism refers to I love my nation. Patriotism is often thought to focus on the values and principles that a country stands for in the abstract, of course, such as freedom and democracy and all those good things. Apple pie added with it. Nationalism is a form of loyalty to one's nation, often characterized by an emphasis on its uniqueness. Saying you are advocating nationalism, whereas I'm advocating patriotism, is a little bit like saying you are part of an ethnic group and I am not. And I'll say more about this later. One of the people who studied that, and we will look at the thought process of a lot of the people who studied nationalism. One of the people who studied early on nationalism, and he's often referred to as the founding father of the study of nationalism, is Hans Kohn. He was born in Europe, in Prague. He sees nationalism as a state of mind. He sees it as a mass phenomenon that is inconceivable in ancient times. It's only in the modern world that we can come to understand a phenomenon like nationalism. And he's written he wrote a tremendous amount about nationalism. And many of the people studying nationalism really use him as a basis to understand how we came in the modern age to understand nationalism. So we are told by another writer, Gordon, that by theorizing nationalism, A.D. Gordon wrote on Hans Kohn, by theorizing nationalism, Kohn clearly hoped to tame it by claiming the modernity of nations, in other words, can't exist in the past, not too much in the past. He countered the insistence on a well-defined national collective going back to time immemorial. So for Hans Kohn, don't tell me that these nations and their sentiments existed long ago in the ancient times. I will not buy it. In other words, historicizing nationalism restrains its license. In the second half of the 20th century, Kohn's approach was adopted, developed and popularized by a young cohort of scholars such as Eric Hobsbawm, Ernest Gellner, Benedict Anderson, and others that we mentioned. And these are the people who talked about concepts like imagined communities. Okay, we imagine the existence of the nation. We have invented these traditions. They're not real. And I should stop here and just comment that, oftentimes in the numerous readings that I've had of various scholars, and in particular Syriac scholars, when looking at modern Assyrians, their criticism is often that Assyrians, invent traditions. Assyrians imagine their link to the past. Assyrians don't really have a continuous history. It's something that they've invented in modern times and so on and so forth. But we see that this criticism is selectively applied to the Assyrians when really, if we're using this kind of language, we should use it across the board to all ethnicities, all nationalities, all peoples, all states across the world. Now, at odds with people like Hans Kohn and the others who followed this line of thinking, one could say, is a current writer, a current political scientist by the name of Azar Gat. According to Azar Gat, the idea of the nation or the idea of nationalism is nothing new. And this is a misunderstanding of history, and we should review all of this history. And I'm going to talk about a slightly more nuanced example of Azar Gat. Of course, there are others There's a Stephen Grosby who was a student at the same time that I was a student at the University of Chicago, who teaches now and believes that the idea of the nation, this the sentiments of nationalism really go back in time much further than we thought. And so they counter Azad, Azargat, and Stephen Grosby and others counter the ideas espoused by Cohen and Gellner and Anderson. So he tells us that ethnicity made the state and the state made ethnicity. In other words, it's not simply an invention. In a reciprocal and dialectical process, indeed, both these threads of causation reveal how highly political ethnicity has been. Why would this state strive to homogenize its realm where possible, were it not for the fact that a sense of common identity immeasurably fostered the people's loyalty, legitimized political rule, and helped to sustain the state's integrity and independence? In other words, this phenomenon really looks like something that existed before. And he tells us, contrary to European bias of the literature, in other words, all of these previous authors that we talked about, on the national phenomenon, already challenged by other leading critics of modernism, Asia, where states evolved the earliest, is also where some of the most ancient national states can be found. And he tells us that Assyria became the first in a series of empires that henceforth would constitute the standard in Southwest Asia, replacing one another down to the 20th century. Now, does this mean that the Assyrian entity existed throughout time unchanged? Of course not. But this is a very interesting comment on all of these other authors, among them Eli Kaduri, who is an Iraqi of Jewish religious faith. He tells us, hence, Eli Kaduri's sweeping and misleading assertion that nationalism and the national state were alien to Asia. So here, God tells us that no, this is a European bias. You really have failed to understand this phenomenon of the nation and nationalism, and we need to look at it from another perspective. And history shows us that it existed in the past and it made sense in the past to exist. And before I go to one of my favorite authors, who is Simo Parpola, a Assyriologist, I want to also mention that another very detailed study, a little more nuanced than Azargat. He does not necessarily agree that nationalism was ancient, but he does agree with Azargat that nationalism is not what Gellner and Anderson and Hans Kohn said it was. Nationalism did exist before. Well, when did it exist for Hershey, Kaspar Hershey, whose approach to nationalism is a little more nuanced? Well, according to Hershey in his new book, his understanding of nationalism and national sentiment comes after the fragmentation of the Roman Empire. When the Roman Empire, Holy Roman Empire, fragments, is falling apart, there are these new entities that form: the German nation, the French nation, and eventually the Italian nation, the Spaniards, and so on. This is when it takes place. This is when nationalism begins. In other words, long before what Hans Kohn and Anderson and others said. In other words, it's much earlier than we thought it was. Not as early as Azargat says it is. But let's follow Azargat's line for a couple of minutes. And let's look at Assyriologist Seymour Porpola's comment on the Neo-Assyrian Empire. And he tells us that the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and presumably the state, was a multi-ethnic state composed of many peoples and tribes of different origins. Of course, we know this also through historical or archaeological finds. In other words, we found, for example, Egyptians living in Nineveh. We found Mitanni living in Nineveh. We find um, Aramaeans living in Nineveh, and we will make a reference to Aramaeans. Its ethnic diversity notwithstanding, it was a uniformly structured political entity with a well-defined and well-guarded borders, and the Assyrian kings certainly regarded it as a unified whole, the land of Ashur, Atret Atur, or Mat Ashur, whose territory they constantly strove to expand for political and economic gain. Of course, to the outside world, it must have appeared as a uniform, monolithic whole whose inhabitants were unhesitatingly identified as Assyrians, regardless of their ethnic backgrounds. So, what does this sound like? This sounds a bit like he's agreeing with Azargat in that there was the formation of something that looked like a nation here. And quoting another Assyriologist who, by the way, who recently passed away, I think on April 13th, may he rest in peace, Mario Fallis, an Italian Assyriologist. He tells us that in some, the people called Aramaeans all but disappear after a long history going back to the Ahlamu. They are all Assyrians now, but Aramaean ethnicity survives in the form of a distinctive language with its attendant cultural content. Now, one could say, of course, that there were other people who, quote unquote, disappeared into the Assyrian identity. Why? Because there was much power, there was much wealth, there was military predominance within the Assyrian state and attributed to the Assyrian state. Whereas if all of these other groups, the Mitanni, the Aramaeans, and others did not have them, it was much easier to dissolve in the cultural, in the political realm of Assyria. And so all of these people were called Assyrians by people outside of, in particular, the Assyrian heartland. Now, this quote is very apt at this time by David Perley, an Assyrian who belonged to the Syriac Orthodox Church and who was an Assyrian nationalist or an Assyrianist. And he tells us one's being an Assyrian is a synthesis, of heritage, religion, and culture, and emotional consciousness that transcends all diversities, theological demographics, or demographic and otherwise. To be an Assyrian is to feel. Can we use the word imagine? The past is my heritage. I shall forget it not. The present, my responsibility. The future, my challenge. And so what really David Perley is doing here is, in the words of Benedict Anderson, or in the words of not Azargat certainly, but in the words of Ernest Gellner, creating, constructing, imagining the Assyrian nation. And also, like Ashur Yusuf and like the early Zionists, rejecting the theological demographic here. In other words, transcending something that is not very good for the nation, because the nation needs to reform itself and to revive itself. I'll end with this sad note today, but we will come back to writers like Benjamin Arsanis. This is a quote from Kichwa magazine, or Kichwa newspaper, excuse me, which was published in Urmi and which really serves as, I would say, one of the first, and we will talk about this when we talk about the formation of Assyrianism, one of the first really important voices of Assyrians, and it is referred to as Sparzona or Ruznama Umtanaya. And he tells us in a very sad way. If we write truthfully, we as a nation are nothing. We do not even possess a name. We very much resemble the inhabitants of the forest, existing without pondering our identity. And what he's saying here, yes, he is angry. Yes, he is unhappy with the way things are, as many of the people who wrote in Kichwa are. But what he's saying is we need to do something about unifying ourselves, about reviving our name, reviving our heritage, and so on. And so the title of this article where this quote is Achnan Iwach Aturaye La Suraye or Keldai, La Suriyaye or Keldai. We need to use this word Aturaye for effect. We need to, in other words, go back and really Benedict Anderson would say we need to reimagine or imagine a new present based on certain visions of the past. And so writers like Benjamin Arsanis, Freydun Bet Oraham, who is called Freydun Aturaya, and Hakim Baba Parhat and others like him were the foundations of this movement of Assyrianism. Now, were they imagining something new or were they basing it on something more ancient? Is something that we will discuss more in the coming classes.